I'm a police officer in South Jersey. I've been doing this since I was 23. For the most part, it's not as exciting as it's cracked up to be. Not a whole lot happens in my county. Usually, the worst calls are disturbance calls or an occasional shoplifting, with something a little more serious sprinkled in there once in a blue moon. I've done just about every possible shift there is. I did my time on the night shift, and there were definitely some weirder calls during the night shift than the day shift. But one time, I was working the night shift. I didn't get any calls. I was just cruising on a quiet road with no streetlights and woods on both sides. I saw the reflection of taillights suddenly approaching on the right-hand side of the road, on the grass. As I got closer, I saw that the driver's side door was open. I started to veer onto the grass as I slowed down, fully planning on getting out to see if the driver needed assistance. I saw someone step out of the car, stand by the door for a second, then start to run into the woods. I radioed the codes for a suspicious person or vehicle, then got out of the car with my flashlight on and my hand on my holster, just in case. In this situation, I had to expect the worst. I got to the front door of the car and looked inside, half expecting to see someone else sitting there, but the car seemed empty. There was a seriously foul odor emanating from inside the car, though. It smelled like a rotting animal. I called out to the woods, asking if anybody was there and needed assistance, then stepped to the tree line, waving the flashlight around. I went back to the car to take a closer look inside the passenger side. There were multiple bloodied tissues and paper towels on the floor on the passenger side, as well as the rear seats. They were soaked in blood. The entire papers were dark red. At some point, while looking inside the car, I heard footsteps inside the woods. I spun around with my flashlight and yelled, "Come out of the woods!" I didn't see anyone. Someone was hiding in there. This was confirmed when I heard a deep voice somewhere beyond the trees and shrubs. I had no idea what the voice said. I responded, saying, "Show yourself. Are you hurt?" I prepared to unholster my gun as I walked a little closer. I repeated myself, asking, "Are you hurt?" No response. The voice I heard before didn't sound like a person in pain, bleeding out. Additionally, why would they run into the woods upon seeing a police car? Something was way off. I went back to the car and requested assistance. I noticed, as I investigated the car further, that it had no plates. When I looked in the rear, I found something that made me almost puke from shock. There was something heavy wrapped in bloodied paper towels. I unwrapped it with my gloves on to find a severed hand. It took me a hot second to realize what it was, because it was completely dark red, soaked in blood. Now this situation went from a 5 to a 10. I radioed that there was a possible murder and needed backup. I turned on my cruiser's lights to help other officers more easily identify my location. When backup arrived, we did a thorough search of the woods, looking for possible blood trails. Nothing, though. There weren't even any blood trails leading from the car, which meant that the hand and blood on the tissues I found might not have been from the person who I saw run into the woods. Eventually, the K9 unit had to come and search for the person. Hours upon hours went into this search, well past dawn, turning up nothing. The vehicle was taken into custody. It had been reported stolen by a resident of a nearby town who said he had no idea who could have stolen his car. Fingerprints were collected from the steering wheel, and when DNA testing was done on the hand, there was not a single match to anybody in the database. To this day, there has never been any progress in finding out who the driver of that car was or whose severed hand that was. My partner and I are assigned to a unit in the sheriff's department that handles tethers, or ankle monitors. One night, while looking for someone who absconded from the program, we followed her last known location to a somewhat shady area of our county. Not many stops are routine, but this one was unsettling from the beginning. My partner walked to the front door as I held the side of the house, keeping my focus on him and the side. After knocking on the door, we could hear movement from inside. As the door opened, a middle-aged woman slowly peered out and looked directly at me. There was no way she knew where I was standing. I wasn't in view of any window at the front or side of the house. What was strange was that most people would answer the person at the door, not look at the side of the house first. After a moment, she let us in when we asked if she knew who Camille was, the person we were searching for. She mumbled something to the effect that Camille was there. Things went from 0 to 100 immediately as she dropped to her hands and knees and started scooting on the floor, yelling for Camille. This lady had some obvious mental issues, and we figured Camille was a caretaker of some kind. We both knew the situation was off, but started searching the house. The entire time, this woman kept yelling for Camille, never once getting back to her feet, just kind of following us on the ground. The time must have been around 8 p.m. and it was dark outside. Inside the home, only one light was on. There were no TVs or any electronics of any kind. The house had a strange feeling to it. The layout of this older-style home had about 4 bedrooms and 2 floors. Every time I left a room, I swear I was in a part of the house I had not just been in. I'd enter a hallway and suddenly be in another part of the house, like I'd entered a dimensional gap or something. The woman would sometimes be right behind me without making a sound. I was starting to question how all of this was possible. At one point, we both went upstairs, which looked like a regular upstairs with bedrooms or a bathroom at the top of the stairs. As we tried to open a door, initially it wouldn't budge. It appeared to have been sealed somehow, like it had been painted over and dried in the seams. After putting in a little extra effort, the door opened, revealing an attic, not bedrooms. If you remember Paranormal Activity, when the guy finds a picture of his wife and child in the insulation, that's what it looked like. There was nothing but storage space, insulation, and an older-style light bulb with a string hanging from it. The lady was just sitting at the bottom of the stairs watching us, occasionally yelling for Camille. After what seemed like an hour of searching this house over and over again, going into rooms I swear I had just left, we called it and cleared the property. As we drove off, the woman was now standing right in front of the door, staring at us as we left. According to dispatch, from when we called in to when we cleared, we were only there for 20 minutes. It felt like we'd been there well over an hour or two. I don't know what was more unsettling. The fact that it was late at night, her yelling Camille's name while scooting on her hands and knees, or quietly appearing behind me when I hadn't heard her move, or the fact that she was standing at the door, just staring as we left. We haven't returned to that house. My family and I live throughout the middle of Georgia. Not many stories come out of this area, and this one I'm about to share makes us glad of that fact. My cousin, who I'll call Bob, has been a police officer for 5 years. He went into the force bright-eyed and optimistic. I guess like so many do. It sounds corny, but he genuinely wanted to make a difference and help improve the lives of the people in his community. One day, they got an alert from a house somewhere between Macon and Roberta. To hear Bob tell it, it was a place people had thought was abandoned for years. That gives you an idea of the state the house was in. Anyway, when they arrived, an older gentleman was sitting on the steps outside the front door with his hands in his pockets. Bob and the other officer approached him and were alarmed to see that the man was crying. Well, not crying really, but sobbing, and he was muttering something to himself about how awful it all was. They tried to question the man, but he was completely incoherent. It took only a couple of seconds to realize that the poor guy was traumatized. As his partner called for another car, Bob drew his gun and decided to enter the house. The smell inside was overpoweringly rancid. He told me the kitchen and living room were a total wreck. It was clear the owners of the house were hoarders. Pots and pans stacked damn near to the ceiling, spoiled food all over the table, takeout containers scattered on the floor. Disgusting. As procedure dictates, Bob called out to see if anyone would answer. Silence. He told me that even with all his training and experience over those past 5 years, his heart rate was already spiking. Gun at the ready, he checked the living room and saw nobody was there. He made his way down the hall, where the smell was getting much worse. Just as it all became too much, he covered his mouth and nose and opened the door to what he suspected was the bedroom. In the bed were 2 corpses, gray-skinned and covered with flies. Despite his churning stomach, Bob decided to go in for a closer look, something he's regretted ever since. One of the corpses was male, the other female. The skin on their faces was already starting to fall off, and flies were flying in and out of their mouths. Some were landing on their eyeballs. As Bob inspected the female's corpse, he was horrified to find that she was holding an even smaller dead body, an infant. It wasn't until a large cockroach crawled out of the dead infant's mouth that Bob ran outside, doubled over, and threw up his lunch all over the steps where the man had been sitting. When the other cars finally arrived, they were able to do a more thorough inspection. The older man that Bob and his partner had met was a former coworker and friend of the dead man. They'd worked together at a peach packing company. When the man hadn't shown up for over a week, the friend went to the house to see if he was okay. The poor man had been the first to witness that horrific scene in the bedroom. The story they put together was that the husband and wife had at some point become addicted to opioids. After some kind of operation a year or so before, they'd started abusing painkillers together. And the addiction grew and grew until they started shooting up and snorting heroin. Their daughter, who wasn't more than a couple years old, had died of neglect. When the husband and wife discovered their baby's corpse, they finally broke completely and decided to end their own lives. The coroner found enough heroin in both their bodies to kill them twice over. Bob's still on the force, but he started drinking a little too much after that. He's been going to therapy, and he's managed to get his drinking under control since. But almost every time we talk, he says that he still has nightmares about that poor child's corpse. And in his nightmares, the baby's still crying. I once responded to a call for a possible breaking and entering. A young woman, living alone, had called in fear, saying she'd come home to find a broken window downstairs. Nothing seemed to be stolen, and she couldn't find anyone inside. But when she went upstairs to bed, she thought she could hear footsteps moving around downstairs. Her call disconnected shortly after, and she wouldn't pick up any of our callbacks. I took the call and arrived at the little house. I knocked on the front door, waited a minute, then knocked again and pressed the doorbell. After another minute, I tried one more time, this time banging really loudly and ringing the bell again. When there was still no answer, I decided to inspect the house. Walking around, I found a busted window, a window big enough to crawl through with ease. I stuck my head into the dark house and yelled, "It's the police." Silence. I radioed to dispatch that the house seemed silent. More officers were en route, but I didn't feel right waiting around in case someone was truly in danger inside. I radioed that I was going in through the window, then climbed through. Stepping over the shattered glass, I drew my gun and started walking through the kitchen, hearing the glass crunch under my boots. I shouted to make my presence known to anyone inside. I didn't hear any footsteps, so I went upstairs, remembering the woman had said she'd heard footsteps downstairs, which would mean her bedroom was likely upstairs. I wasn't trying to be too quiet as I went up, but I also wasn't stomping around. I didn't know what to expect, whether someone with a weapon was in the house, or if the woman was just alone in bed. "Ma'am, it's a police officer. Are you here?" I called. A soft female voice answered from upstairs, saying, "Yes." I followed the voice to one of the bedrooms, where I saw a woman sitting up in bed under the covers. She looked at me and I asked if she was okay. She said she was fine, though I noticed a slight tremble in her voice. I kept the lights off in the bedroom, examining her face in the moonlight. She looked distressed. I told her I was responding to her phone call, then asked why she'd hung up and hadn't picked up our callbacks. She stuttered and said, "No one is here." I caught on to what was happening. I glanced at the closet and made a slight nod to her. She very subtly shook her head, "No." Then I looked down under the bed and pointed. She gave a slight nod, confirming it. The weight of what to do next was heavy. The best idea I could come up with on the spot was to say, "All right, ma'am, I just need you to sign this report form, stating that I was here and found nothing unusual." She agreed, got up from the bed, and came over to me. When she was close enough, I pushed her out of the room, drew my gun, and yelled, "Come out from under the bed." I still shook when I saw a dark figure slowly emerge from under the bed. I ordered, "Hands first, and drop any weapons." I heard a clank as something hit the floor. It turned out to be a gun. A middle-aged man in all black clothes crawled out from under the bed with his hands up. I made the arrest on the spot and brought him outside, just as the other officers were arriving. The woman later explained that she'd hung up on the police when she thought the footsteps were coming upstairs. She didn't want the intruder to hear the audio from the call. She hadn't picked up the phone because, by then, the intruder had entered her room and held her at gunpoint. Since the police were already on their way, instead of fleeing, he'd threatened to shoot her if she made a sound when we arrived. After I'd rung the bell, he hid under the bed and told her to pretend he wasn't there. I'm glad I was able to catch on to the situation. It could have gone a number of ways if I hadn't. I work nights for the Sheriff's Department in Bergen County. I've been on the force for 2 years. I haven't seen too much craziness, aside from late-night drug arrests, a few robbery calls, and a few assault calls. Northeastern Bergen County is pretty low crime after all, so those are usually the worst calls I deal with. There was this one night that I received a disturbance call to investigate a scream that came from a house nearby. Usually, a call like this would mean a domestic dispute, or even just something as harmless as people drinking and being too loud. I arrived at the house though, and I had to confirm twice that it was the correct house, because none of the lights were on. There was a car in the driveway though, a blue Toyota Sienna minivan. Someone was home. I walked over to knock on the door a few times. The neighbor must have seen my car because he came out and walked over, reporting that he was the one to call the police. He told me he heard a blood-curdling scream from the house, and that the woman who lives there lives alone but occasionally had her boyfriend over, making it slightly more concerning. I tried the doorknob now, which was locked. I then made my way around the house, trying all the windows, which were all locked. All but one of the backyard windows. It was already slid completely up, enough for someone to climb through. This was a red flag considering every other window was closed. I requested backup to the scene, and once I got confirmation, I climbed into the house through the window. I started to flick every light on that I could find in the house, starting in the kitchen and working my way to the living room. And yes, it's advisable for police to turn on the lights when investigating buildings. What you see in TV shows and movies where they leave the lights off is only done for suspense. I called out for the woman, trying to assure her it's okay, the police were here. Though, at that time, I still didn't know what exactly the situation was, other than she was reported screaming. There was no response, no matter how loud I yelled. The first floor was clear, so there was only the upstairs left to check. I wanted to wait for backup to arrive because I was nervous about what I'd find up there. But I'd also not forgive myself if I waited and wasted precious time that I could have used to save this woman from a possible medical emergency. Before going up the stairs, I unlocked the front door for when backup would arrive. I then walked up the carpeted stairs quietly, and as I got halfway up the stairs, I peered over the ledge onto the second floor. There were 4 doors up there. I flicked on the light switch in the hallway and called out one more time. I heard a creak-type sound come from behind one of the doors, so she had to be in there. I opened the door, and it was a bedroom. The light was off, but the light from the hall was plenty to see a woman laying in bed under the covers. I saw the back of her head. I walked over to her to make sure she was okay, but as I got close, I noticed dark stains that soaked the other side of the covers. The side of her I couldn't see from the door. I yanked the covers off the woman and realized it was blood, and she'd been stabbed multiple times, but she was still breathing. I grabbed my walkie and reported a stabbing, requesting immediate backup and an ambulance. The creak I heard moments before suddenly made no sense if this woman was in bed like this and she was unconscious. Someone had placed her in the bed, most likely. I did a 360 in place, looking around the room. There was a closet. It was instinctively the first place I'd think to look. I had my gun drawn, and I held my hand on the doorknob for 5 seconds, gathering the courage to yank the door open. When I finally did, there was no one inside. I turned around again to look at the bed, at the bleeding woman. Then I thought, the bed. I got on my knees to be level with the bottom of the bed. I yanked the bed wrap covering the bottom of the bed up and was then eye to eye with a man wearing a face mask covering the lower half of his face. I shrieked and yelled, "Show me your hands!" He slowly raised his hands above his head as much as he could. I got up and told him to get out from under the bed slowly and made sure he wasn't holding the knife. I had him stand in the corner with his hands up until my backup came. I wasn't about to try and handcuff him in there alone when he could have any weapon on his person. I told backup to meet me upstairs, and when they entered the house, I called up to them. Only then did I place the man under arrest. An ambulance arrived not too long after, and the woman was rushed to the hospital, and she managed to survive being stabbed 6 times. The man who did it was, in fact, her boyfriend, which I didn't find too surprising, honestly. The man had found out that she cheated on him with his friend, and when he called her about it, she broke up with him over the phone, which must have caused the man to snap. I'm very thankful the woman survived. This story was told to me by my best friend's uncle, who works the night shift as a police officer in our city. A year or so ago, Mike, my best friend's uncle, was out on his nightly patrol with his partner Steve. They've been working together for years, and they're both Army veterans, so they're very level-headed and calm people, perfect for being police officers. When they got a call from a landlord at an apartment complex complaining about one of his tenants, they didn't really expect anything bad. They get calls like that all the time, so they headed over to see what was going on. When they arrived, the landlord greeted them outside. It was probably 1 or 2 in the morning. Everyone from the complex was standing out in the grass, which was odd. The landlord approached Mike and Steve and started to rant about one of their neighbors being crazy and turning all the water on in his apartment. Apparently, he was some guy in his 30s, and he'd been acting weird lately. Mike could see that there was water seeping out from the front door of the place and decided they had to go in and do a welfare check on the guy. When they walked in, water was pouring down the stairs and clearly flooding the building, which meant that this water had to have been turned on for hours to cause this kind of damage. They climbed to the 2nd story and knocked on the door where the water was gushing out from. The landlord told them that the tenant's name was Adam, and so they pounded on the door, calling his name. No one answered for a couple of minutes, and so they decided to break the door down. When they did, they spotted Adam standing in his kitchen. All of the sinks, the shower, the toilet from the bathroom, and a hose from outside were gushing water everywhere. Adam was standing there shaking. His eyes were wide like he was terrified to move. "Adam, what's going on? Are you all right?" Mike asked while his partner Steve walked further inside to check everything out. Steve walked into the bathroom to turn off the water and to make sure no one else was in the apartment. Mike slowly approached Adam, who seemed terrified because he was shaking so much. He didn't even look at Mike as he approached. Again, he was asked what was wrong, and he finally stuttered out that there are people in the walls. Mike didn't hear what he was saying at first, but as he got closer, Adam started to repeat it over and over, louder and louder. "There are people in the walls," until he was almost screaming it, getting himself worked up. Steve walked into the bedroom next and was clearing the room when he checked the closet and noticed something as he turned on the light. There was a very faint line that ran across the wall. At first, he didn't think anything of it, but then he heard what Adam was screaming, and a sinking feeling hit his gut. The longer he stared at it, the more he realized that the line was in the shape of a door, cut out of the wall. It clearly wasn't meant to be there. Mike was about to lead Adam out of the apartment when Steve suddenly called to him, "You better take a look at this." Mike went into the other room to see Steve pointing his gun at the wall in the bedroom, clearly freaked out. They both approached the door, guns raised, while Adam started to cry in the back room. Steve quickly pulled a piece of wall back, and they both froze when 3 sets of eyes stared back at them. 3 people were pressed together in this tiny space in the wall, their faces painted in weird patterns. Both Steve and Mike ordered them out and handcuffed each one. By that time, backup had arrived, and some other police officers got Adam out of there. They led the 3 downstairs and sent them off to jail. Mike and Steve were deeply disturbed by the whole exchange. It was only made worse when, a couple of months later, they found out that the 3 people in the wall were from some crazy cult out in the woods, and they were trying to get Adam to join them. They preyed on him because they knew he had a past history of being mentally unstable, and they were trying to scare him. He had turned on all the water in an attempt to flush them out of his own home. To this day, Mike and Steve say that this was the most disturbing call they have ever been on.